When I think about nationally known newspaper humor columnists of my time, there aren't that many. Russell Baker, Art Buchwald, and then Dave Barry. All guys. Irma Bombeck, although she confined herself to the suburban housewife beat. And I can say this because we're on Zoom and you can't throw things at me. Never found her very funny. I've never known where to put Gail Collins in this. She is very funny, but I think of her as a political columnist who does humor. Joyce does not mention a prominent humor columnist that should be on that list, which is Joyce Wadler. But that's only because she's too modest.
Right.
Joyce continues, I don't know why there are so few. It's always seemed odd to me that a newspaper would have a dozen political columnists, a half a dozen sports columnists, but no humor columnists. Are editors afraid of humor? Is it something they don't value? Whatever the reason, being a humor columnist for a newspaper is a very tough racket. And Alexandra will tell us about that. Today, we have someone who has succeeded brilliantly as a national humor columnist for nearly a decade. Alexandra Petri. Petri or Petri?
Petri, actually.
Petri, okay. The humor columnist for the Washington Post. Petri is also the youngest person in the Washington Post's history to be given a column. She began writing essays for the Post when she was still in college. That was Harvard, from which she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She was given her regular Saturday column in the print edition in 2012 when she was 24. Petri has done stand-up comedy. She's a Helen Hayes Awarded nominated playwright. She's an author of the book, A Field Guide to Awkward Silences. And Petri is fearless and takes shots at everybody. Trump and Republican enablers are frequent targets. A column earlier this month, February 4th, says it all with the headline, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless GOP. Good morning, fellow Republicans, that column begins. Were your erasures equally a success? I feel 4 years lighter, and I have no recollection of anything that I said, did, or endorsed during that time. Remember, the California realtor who was part of the mob who broke into the Capitol but paused before entering to promote her business? Petri's column on that was, I'm Johns Wilkes Booth, and now is probably as good a time to promote myself as any. She's also gone after the newly elected president when Biden's team shut down questions about where President Biden stood on Trump's impeachment trial. Petri wrote a column called, Sorry, President Biden is much too busy to notice there's an impeachment going on. Petri's work can be wonderfully surreal. She wrote a column about Melania Trump giving a tour of the White House Christmas decorations, styled after Dante's Inferno. The name of the column, The 9 Circles of Melania. There was also a column about House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, calling newly elected Congresswoman and conspiracy theorist Marjorie Taylor Greene into his office. Alexandra theorized about several ways that conversation might have gone. Marjorie Taylor Greene arrives in Leader McCarthy's office. They talk about the weather for 5 minutes, then another 5 minutes, then another 5 minutes after that. He keeps her in his office talking about the weather for the next 2 years, while the Republicans locate and run a suitable replacement in her district. Talking about her work, Alexandra once said, my goal is to be weirder than everybody else and hope no one stops me. So far, no one has. We don't know how she's gotten away with it. Maybe she'll tell us now. Delighted to introduce Alexandra Petri.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's really nifty to be here, and I hope I'll get to, we can open this up to questions soon, but sort of briefly, I guess, I look back on my decision to enter journalism as a career, and I feel sort of like the guy in the cartoon who's constantly dodging anvils without realizing it, because I started at the Post in 2009 as a summer intern, and then I returned the next summer. And at the end of this time, I thought I was supposed to be going to Oxford to study Renaissance poetry because I heard that was where the real money was. And so I but with the sort of unerring instinct of a rat beelining towards a sinking ship, I was like, no, maybe I'll stick with this journalism thing. And so, because I said, well, if you want to stay on, you can keep staying and writing stuff. People seem to be reading what you're writing. And Oxford requires you, if you're planning not to, if you want to maybe defer the time that you arrive there, to send them a note explaining the circumstances. And I thought, well, maybe I could just postpone it for a year, because I mean, you know, how many newspapers are still going to be in print after 1 year from now? So maybe I can just milk this. So I sent them a note explaining that I viewed, and some of the special circumstances where you can delay your arrival, or like if you're dying or a member of your family is physically dying. And so I sent them a note saying, I've always viewed print journalism as a dear member of my family, and I don't think it's long for this world, and maybe I can defer going for a year. And amazingly, they sent back a note saying, we noticed that you declined any position here. And so I'm like, well, journalism it is. And fortunately, then, because I mean, 2009, 2010 was a strange time to arrive at a newspaper, because everyone was constantly having cake all of the time. Not in the sense that sort of we were extravagantly having cake, but in the sense that you would get a cake whenever somebody took a buyout. And so we were just every day, it'd be like another cake. And it's like, well, on the level of me that likes cake, I'm thrilled. And on the level of me that likes to have quality people employed here, I'm deeply saddened. But then I just sort of kept clinging on. I did a blog. This was in the early blog days when people would say things like, you know, if you want a blog, we're not sure what it is. Maybe if you have an article and you have some parts that didn't fit in there, just put them on the blog. And so nobody was quite sure what to do with it. But Dana Milbank and I started a humor blog, and gradually I sort of took it over. We split off. We both kept writing columns. I wrote a column that started appearing in the print edition, and then just sort of barnacled on for a while. And I feel like an old salt, because now Marty Baird is leaving, and I'm like, I outlasted him. I was there when he came, and now I'm there that he's leaving. So it's funny, because the difficulty of having led with your youth sort of early in your career is that eventually you just become a formerly young person, which I guess is descriptive of everyone. But it's so sort of it's like, well, I used to be quite young, and now I'm less young, but I'm more experienced, I hope. And so I do think it's been a fascinating 10 years to be doing journalism, and specifically doing humor columnism within that. And people talk a lot about sort of journalism in the age of Trump and humor in the age of Trump. And that is still very fresh in my mind. I still wake up at like 3 a.m. just start awake, terrified that there will be a tweet that has entirely changed the course of the nation's foreign policy. And so it's been nice over the last couple of weeks to see sort of the re-blooming of the old stories that you remember from a time when there wasn't sort of a constant drumbeat of bad chaos that was caught sort of swallowing everything else in the news cycle. Because I do really feel that President Trump was this void into which all these interesting, smart people were pouring all of they're like, if we can just understand him, maybe we'll figure it out. And so just absolute barrels of ink were getting spilled on, and he just consumed all of them. And like a black hole, sort of time around him distorted. It was only 4 years, but I truly have no conception of time. Part of that is the past year did whatever vestiges of my understanding of how time is supposed to be moving were completely devastated by having to spend the past year just in my house, which was my fault. You know, I give my husband due credit for not having held this over my head, but I decided to go to CPAC to cover it last year because they were doing a play version of the text between Strzok and Page, and it seemed like a very strange sort of swatting a fly with a Buick type situation. And so I wanted to see what it was about. And as a consequence of having gone to CPAC, we then had to quarantine like 3 weeks earlier than everybody else. So by the time we were free to go back to the office was shut. So he hasn't held that over me though, which I feel like I would 100%. If I'd had to spend 3 bonus weeks of normality locked in my house because my spouse had gone to CPAC, I would have words, but he's been very nice about it. it's been funny watching the stories that used to get buried under the deluge of absolute bad chaos reemerging. Like the other day, Joe Biden ate a bagel that was toasted in a way that people didn't like. And I'm like, oh, remember stories like that? Or there's, I'm trying to think, there was GameStop with the, just everybody buying GameStop bets. Just the fact that that story was able to be like, here's the major headlines for a week and we're all talking about it. It was just so nice to get to see everything sprouting and nature returning to itself again. And I do think that people always were saying during the Trump era, well, like you as a humor columnist must be thrilled because there's so much material. And I was never actually thrilled because there was certainly a lot happening, but A, people were getting hurt, which makes it very hard to laugh. And B, it was just, there was a terrible sameness in addition to the fact that it was all very strange to begin with. So you couldn't exaggerate it because it was already cranked up to 11. I mean, Four Seasons landscaping, that was just a thing that happened. All you had to do was describe that in most cases. So it was taking your job for you and, but cranking the volume up in a very strange way. So I don't miss that. Also, to call it like a garbage fire, I always say was sort of a bad term because garbage fires at least cast light and get rid of garbage. And it wasn't doing any of those things. So I don't miss it. And I'm excited to get to write about, bagels and just because it's not as though the country is short of problems or amusements. And only over the past 4 years would anyone say anything like, I can't imagine there'd be anything funny in Joe Biden's presidency. Like, no, that's going to be absolutely a ride full of thrills and amusements. But hopefully without, in addition to all the usual things that are going wrong, which are plenteous and have been since the country got started 250 odd, very odd years ago. You just don't have the constant drumbeat of, oh no, a very strange thing that usually wouldn't happen is now happening that's throwing everything off chaotically in addition to the usual things that are going on. So I'm excited for the next few years of typing vigorously, but I do hope the vaccine will get rolled out and we'll get to go to the office and see people. That would be nice. Because as somebody who usually is writing like not from the office, I would go in periodically to remind people that I existed and sort of stare at the water cooler and marvel at it as you're supposed to do. And now I'm like, you really start missing the inconveniences of your previous life where you're like, I just wish I could stand in an indoor space that was crowded and shout at people and have difficulty being heard as like drinks were spilled on my foot. And I want to be in the office, like under that horrible lighting that sort of buzzes with CNN on silently on all these TVs overhead. And I miss those times. And I'm excited for their return. But I think, yeah, please, let's roll in some questions. I'll peer into the chat.
One question is the world less funny now that Trump is gone? But I'm not sure it was ever very funny when he was here.
Yeah, I would say funny peculiar, not funny ha-ha.
Yes, right. I mean, there weren't a lot of belly laughs, especially in the last couple of years.
Also, sort of what you think is funny does depend on what you think is true. So if someone makes an observation that you think is just not grounded in any kind of reality, it's not going to be funny to you unless you're just really into the absurd. So if you see the world the way President Trump saw it, and he's insulting somebody, you might think, oh, that's a funny insult. But if you don't, then it's just sort of, oh gosh, this is mean and exhausting. And so I think as somebody who doesn't, spoiler alert, share President Trump's worldview, it wasn't a very funny 4 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to other
I must say that Colbert has succeeded in saying some funny things about the Trump administration. Is he? Are you an admirer of his?
Yes. No. And I love what he used to do on the Colbert Report. I just feel like it's funny when because I would watch that religiously. Just the way he was able to thread that satire was just a real inspiration. And now it's just like, oh, he's a person who makes jokes. He's not playing this character, but like to play the character as well as he did for as long as he did, I was just blown away by. So I'm glad he also gets his telos and his joyous conclusion where he gets to be one of the late night Jimmies.
Hi, Alexandra, listen, I'm curious about pushback. You said you wanted to be someone who, as crazy as possible without anybody trying to stop you. And so far, nobody had. But I think you said that about 3 years ago. In my experience of doing humor in a newspaper is these guys are scared. They're nervous. So has anybody tried to push back? Have you lost any columns?
Sometimes you think when you've conceived an idea that it's going to work out a lot better than it does, or you write the whole thing down and you think, I'm not actually sure about this. And my tendency when I'm not sure is just, I would rather not publish something that I'm not 100% about. Like, I think there was a while when people were making a bunch of sort of barren jokes. And I'm like, I'm not sure I want to, like, because I thought I had an angle, but I'm also like, that's a kid. He didn't ask to be stuck in this situation. And so things like that, where I feel like there's some sort of, you think, oh, I'm treading this edge perfectly. But if you have any doubt about it, I tend to think if there's another way of doing it or a different angle. Because the good thing about the internet is that there's not a page limit. But the bad thing about the internet is that anything you do wind up going with is there. It's just going to live there forever.
Is it in the middle of a cancel culture to be writing humor? Isn't it a little scary?
What does scare me is like Twitter, certainly as a medium. Well, I always like it because I'm like, I get to go on Twitter and be excited about things that I'm genuinely excited about. And, but it is conducive. It's something you have on your phone. You don't have like an editor. It's just you sort of typing a thought. And you're like, this is a great thought and I'm expressing it perfectly. And there's, there could be a day when you have a thought and you think, oh no, I've expressed this perfectly. And it was carelessly put out, or like you were not perfectly sober, or any number of things can occur. And then you've got, people are hurt by that. So I do think you have to be cautious. Like, because when I was growing up on the internet, it was like sort of a wild type, just everyone's tumbleweeds. You don't know who a dog is. Yeah, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That's what I was trying to say in that very confusing sentence that I just promulgated. But so now it's like, well, everything's going to be there. I think kids who are growing up now are like, oh, they sort of know theoretically that like their TikToks and everything are going to be there forever, but they haven't experienced it in its full consequences. So yeah, I do worry about, because the last thing you do want to do when you have a platform is do something that will be hurtful to people or bother them. And then there's also sometimes like people will be like in bad faith being like, well, we've chosen to interpret this in a negative way. But I don't know. I think there are bigger problems these days than cancel culture. But like watching the impeachment, it was very funny watching them describe it as like, this is constitutional cancel culture. And it's like, the only way to frame this whole thing that was going on was in terms of cancel culture. This seems a little peculiar, but I don't know. I think the internet is a fun and scary place. That's my...
Right. You were talking about being able to, not censor yourself, but, you had your own, critical sense of this is working and that isn't working. And that's one thing, and that's great. But have you had the experience of an editor actually, old term, I'm feeling very retro, spiking a column and saying, you can't do this?
on the occasions when the decision was made to like not go with something, it would be something where I was also like, I'm a little on the fence about this. I want to have somebody else read it. It hasn't been like, here's a hammer coming from above. This is completely out of nowhere. So mostly it's been like a mutual decision.
Okay. And there hasn't been any, you haven't been the subject of any kind of doxing or attack? Fortunately,
no. Because I see like friends who've had much worse experiences on the internet than I've had, and there, but for the grace of, but yeah, no, I get a lot of mean emails, certainly, but, and the occasional mean tweet or like Zoom bombing, but nothing compared to what other friends, mostly women, have.
And what about regrets? Anything that you might have thought was fine going in, but then afterwards, the next morning, you're going, oh, why did I do that? I wish I could take that back. I was so mean.
One thing I do feel bad about, actually, looking back, like late Palin, early Trump, there was a sort of a few years in there when everyone was just like, let's write about Sarah Palin every day. And then suddenly it stopped, but it was just, but my theory, and I'm not sure if it's entirely accurate, was that it stopped. And then shortly in that same slot of like, I'm so mad about this, I'm going to write about it all the time, like Donald Trump started arising. And I wonder if there wouldn't have been, like, if you look back and you're like, oh man, look at this fellow and what impact he's had. If all of those early jokes about like, isn't it strange that this person's doing this, were worth it and didn't ultimately help get into the snowball of his getting a lot of attention and showing up. Because people always talk about him as someone who has this remarkable gift to be covered, as though that's like a thing that he possesses that isn't the series of choices other people are making. And so to the extent that I was one of those people making that choice, I wonder if that was good.
Have you ever run into anybody you've dissed in person? I know these days it's less of a problem, but has that happened?
I think I have, but I don't know that the person had read it or cared about it.
Oh, okay, then that's
yeah, it'd be one of those things where like, I knew that I'd written something, but they clearly were not an avid Petri reader.
You're the daughter of a longtime congressman.
I am.
How did that go when you told your dad that you were going to make profession out of making fun of him and his like?
Well, I think he fortunately has always had a good sense of humor, which has helped considerably. I think in order to do the job that he did, or to do the job that I'm doing, you have to have a sense of humor. And I also think journalism and politics are two very similar professions, because in their ideal form, I think they're premised on the idea that what people think is good and important. And so one of my favorite memories of like growing up was getting to go to all these parades, and people would like, they'd be like, oh, that's my congressman. And like people would come up, they'd be like literally like people like who've been just moments ago, like dressed as a clown, like handing out candy, would come up and be like, I've actually got a thought about how the government should be running. And they would like tell him and he would listen. And I'm like, this is so cool. You get to meet so many people. You get to like hear so many different points of view. And like sometimes like a man dressed as a clown will like come and give you a serious political opinion. And I just thought that was the neatest thing. And I'm like, what are other professions where you could do this? And so journalism is one of them. And so anytime I can leave, although these days it's been a while, but anytime I can go out and go somewhere and just get to like see a world full of people and hear what they're thinking, it's the bee's knees.
So you grew up in Washington and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah. How big a contrast was that?
Like you could get a driver's license earlier in Wisconsin than you could in DC. You had to wait to be 18. And so as the worst driver of all my friends, it was weird that I was the one who'd somehow gotten this license first. But I took a summer driving class, and it was, they still didn't trust me, but I think I did theoretically have a license that would allow me to get around places. So that was a big contrast. Also the dairy products much better in Wisconsin, and like the dairy breakfasts, Culver's. You don't have Culver's in DC, which is constantly devastating to me. Which you can get a butter burger. Have you ever had a butter burger? It's exactly what the name sounds like, and it's to die for. And I would also go to volleyball camp there every summer, and I was like the shortest, most brunette person at the volleyball camp because Wisconsin was like everybody was like 6 feet tall and extremely blonde. At least that was my experience of what was going on.
When you said Barron jokes, I thought you meant Marty. What about Marty Barron jokes? Ralph Blumenthal asks.
The Spotlight came out. We all got to go and like they had like a little screening of like, oh, look at Spotlight, which is kind of funny. It's like, what other professions do you get to go to a movie and the whole premise is like, check this out. The editor over, not my boss, because I'm like in the opinion section, but like, your boss is pretty cool, and here's a movie where Liev Schreiber plays him. So it was also funny because then they had all of these, like they interviewed the costumer and they were like, how did you get the costume so right? How did you know how wrinkled the shirts needed to be? Everyone's shirt is just perfectly wrinkled and like slightly too large. And that just, how did you do that? And the costumer's like, well, yes, well, I tried very hard because journalists are known for being poor dressers. And it was just like, I feel that I'm included in this, and I'm not sure that I like it. But yeah, I don't know. That was a fun movie. Someone asks,
is there a humor generation gap? You know, do millennials have a different sense of humor than boomers?
I think it's a treat when boomers enjoy my column. Also, column is sort of like a vintage format. Like, I feel like all the millennials are like, we're making TikToks now. TikToks are where the commentary is. That's not even millennials. Like, the funny thing is people say millennials, and millennials, like, we're in our 30s now. We have mortgages. And like Gen Z is really where it's at. They're all doing the TikToks, and they've got Lorde, I think, is one of their pop stars. They've got, Gen Z is really, they're coming out strong, and I'm excited for them as a concept. But I do think millennials have a slightly different sense of humor that's sort of hard to describe, where we like anti-comedy, which if you see like a commercial and you're like, nothing in that commercial was funny, but I think that was the point. That's sort of, I think it's because our sensibility is starting to penetrate the mass advertising market. But yeah, it's hard to describe. It's one of those like that old judges saying about obscenity, where it's like, you know it when you see it. Not like humor is in the groin of the beholder. That's a different judge statement about obscenity. It's deeply reference based. It's like that one, I say now making a reference to illustrate my point, like that one Star Trek episode where everyone communicates by referencing this work that they all as a planet have encountered. And so they're just talking in memes. I feel like millennials, we love to talk in memes. Here's a reaction GIF. Here's an allusion to something. And so you have this weird multi-layered, like ironic thing going on, but we also appreciate a good joke. And I do feel like also in the question, it says getting annoyed by boomers' dad jokes. And I have a bone to pick with the phrase dad jokes, because I feel like, you know, like, why are we gendering puns? That's my angry horse, and I'm going to climb on it. But yeah, as an avid punster, I feel like groan-inducing, terrible puns can be made by people of all genders, and we don't need to give them to the dads. Like, because mom jokes are always like at the expense of the mom. It's always like, your mom is so foolish that she barely knows where her telephone directory is. And the dad jokes are, he's always like, hello, hungry, I'm dad. And I think we got to claim puns for everyone.
I think everyone wants to hear about two things. One, you're winning the pun off contest. What was that like? And two, your appearance on Jeopardy.
Yeah, RIP to Alex Trebek. So Jeopardy was a lot of fun. The studio was very cold. I think I got on at exactly the perfect time, because it was like right after high school. So I was technically old enough to take the adult test, but also it meant that I would know more about like biology than ever at any subsequent point of my life I will know. So like I was fresh off of like AP biology and like AP human geography, and like got all those good APs in there. And so then I was able to recollect like what the mitochondria is. Like, is it the powerhouse of the cell? I had that at my fingertips at that time. Whereas now, if I were to go on, it's just sort of if you're not somebody who was in a movie and my brain somehow thinks that's important knowledge to store, and it's always assiduously being like, did you know that was Christian Bale? And it's like, I don't want to know this. I want to know what the capital of, I can't even remember any countries, but clearly I want to know what their capitals are. But instead I know that that's Christian Bale and the guy next to him is Dane DeHaan. I don't want that information, but it's what I have. So I think I wouldn't do as well. But yeah, it was Alex Trebek, and it was two people, and I made what was described as the worst Final Jeopardy wager of all time by the commenters in the online message boards at the time, because it turns out when the two people ahead of you are tied, you should bet nothing because they have to bet a lot instead of betting everything, which is what I did. And then I also did not get the question right. But they still give you a prize just for coming in third. Like, you don't get the amount of money that it says that you're getting if you're second or third. You just get a fixed prize. And so I was able to buy myself a laptop. So that all worked out.
And the pun off?
Oh, the pun off. So every year in Austin, there's this thing called the O. Henry pun off, which has been going on for about 40 years. And it's a semi-formal pun competition where people come from all over. It's technically international because they have, like, there was a British guy one year. I saw him. He was dressed as a chicken. And they have two different categories. There's like punniest in show, which is you come in, you've got 90 seconds to 2 minutes of prepared puns on a theme of your own choosing, and you receive a judge's score. And that was the category where I won, which was, I did Presidents of the United States in order. And it was, you got, at the time there were only 44. So it was doable in under 2 minutes. And then there's also pun slingers, which if you go there, I highly recommend checking it out, because they give you a topic which you haven't seen in advance. And then you and a competitor have to go back and forth punning on this topic until you run out of puns or repeat a pun or do something that people think was a figurative use of a literal term and was not a pun, or like if it's like temperature, you say like, boy, this is some hot competition. That wouldn't be a pun. That'd just be, using it as a modifier. So then the judges will ding you, but that goes on for hours. Like if your idea of a good afternoon is watching two people trade agricultural puns for a full 40 minutes, then go to the Austin pun off, or spend the afternoon doing something else, because that's where the people whose idea of a good time is spending 40 minutes trading agricultural puns, that's where they all are. And they also have a good pun scene in Brooklyn. So if you head down to the Brooklyn Punderdome 3000, it's all virtual now. So it's on Zoom, as everything is these days, but it's still nice. The pun scene, it's thriving. They say, the Wall Street Journal had this piece that said that puns thrive in times of chaos. And so I guess now is a great time for puns.
So someone asks, your husband is an editorial writer at the Post, and I guess it was an office romance.
Yes.
And do you ever run your columns by him? I have a better question. Does he ever run his editorials by you?
We mostly don't. Every so often usually he'll hear me laughing to myself, and then a few hours later, I'll hear him laughing to himself if I've done a successful column and he's enjoying it after it publishes. But yeah, sometimes he'll hear me laughing, and that's because I'm reading the editorial and I can't believe the position we're taking. No, I'm kidding. Usually, because the funny thing is he is a very good editor, so he would be a good person to run things by. But I think I mostly prefer surprising him with them after the fact, because I do have an editor I like very much.
Have you told him that his editorials need to be funnier?
It's in the time, in the space allotted, it's really hard to do. I was always trying to put jokes in when I was an intern, and like you get like one sentence for a joke tops, and it has to be a really good joke, and it's never worth it. I don't know. I never had any success getting jokes into the editorials. But I'll tell him. I'll see what he says.
Yeah. Okay.
Alexandra, you have the regular Saturday column or in the print edition, but I think in the past week, it looked to me like you had something like 4 or 5 columns.
Yeah, I do one a day on average, because I'm still internet brain, where I think if you don't publish, publish or perish, but the publishing is online. And I think that's an academia statement. I'm not even sure where I'm getting this, but anyway, it results in my trying to write something every day, and which I think does help because I'm one of those people who's very motivated by deadlines. Yeah. To quote Douglas Adams, I love the whooshing noise they make as they fly by. But I think if I only had to write one every week, it would take all week long, and I would pace and pace, and just absolutely chaos. A word that I'm using, the big chaos lobby is gonna get a bunch of money from me after, or send me a gift basket or something. However this arrangement's working, either they're paying me to overuse their word, or I'm using it so much I'm gonna get a sponsorship. Something's going on here. Anyway, the word's coming out a lot. But I think having to do it only once a day means that you can't get too precious about it, which is helpful to me. Otherwise, I would just be finely crafting. When I think of like all the long-term writing projects, it's always just like 3 days or a week before the deadline, and I'm just scrambling. Even though, I had 2 years, I could have written the play at any point during those 2 years, but no, it's always just that sweet run up to the actual due date.
Alexandra, did you just say that you wrote a play in 3 days?
Well, I mean, Noel Coward wrote all his best plays in 3 days.
I have to get a knife and cut my throat here, but go on, just tell.
No. I had started most of it. It's just like the last few pages of it. Like sometimes the best way of getting people to is like you say, I've already written the play, and then you quickly go off and you type as fast as you can, and then you send them the play that results. But sometimes this doesn't work, and then you only have 28 pages, and you say, when I said that I had written the whole play, what I meant was that I had written it, but I can't show you the last 40 pages because they only exist in my mind. I think 3 days is optimistic. I would say like more like 3 weeks. But
so wait, I was going to ask you if you've ever had that sort of morning where you wake up and you say, I've got nothing. And it sounds like this has never happened.
I know, every day. But then I get a lot of coffee and I walk around. I do miss having to go to a place because walking is so good for just clearing your mind about what's going on. Or you stare at a blank wall for a long period of time, or you read something. I'm always amazed because I'm almost like, I always think that like reading something that has nothing to do with what I'm trying to work on will be a distraction, but actually it's nice cross-pollination. It's like the only way you can encounter people these days, but other than Zoom and shouting across 6 feet of greensward.
You're not in the office and you're not walking around the city. Is that?
Yeah. No, so it's just me sort of sitting in the house reading things.
Yeah.
So like I got to the point where I was like, I would text my friends like updates from my reading as though it was like gossip about a person we all knew. Cause I was like, early on, I was like, I'm gonna read War and Peace, and it was fine. But then I read Rousseau's Confessions, and those were incredible. Highly recommend them because he's just a disaster of a human being. And I would just be sitting there texting my friends like, I can't believe he's just abandoned his 6th child at a foundling hospital, and he has the audacity to write a book on parenting. And they were just like, why am I subscribed to these texts? Why are you texting me about Rousseau? I'm like, because I'm trying to maintain a human connection, Kyle.
I mean, it isn't like you get up these days and read the morning paper. What is your
it sure is. I get the morning paper and I read it. I love reading a print
What do
paper.
you read? What do you read for? Because you're very political and you're very, something comes up and bam, you've gotten the column on it. You're fast. So what are your basic reading? What are your sources?
So I'll read the paper both in print for like slower developing things and online. I will be reading it online. Like when the story goes up, like the night before it shows up, I'll be reading it. Okay. I do keep Twitter open a lot, which is both very distracting, but sometimes like before the thing is even a news story, people are tweeting about it. And I miss, like Google used to have a good sort of like news service. Yeah. But now that like you can go to like Meme-random and see what the journalists are talking about. And I do that periodically. But yeah, a lot of it is just Twitter and going to the home pages of various news sites and seeing what the stories are. Because yeah, I do feel like they say every day you read the equivalent of On the Road, and that does feel about right. Just like in terms of internet, just constantly scrolling through what's going on.
Do you have Twitter exchanges with other humorists?
Oh yeah, periodically. Mostly pun exchanges. I have a friend who is an inveterate punster, and so whenever there's like a breaking news headline, we'll go back and forth on it if there's puns to be made.
Are you and Borowitz in communication?
I don't think he's on Twitter, but I do read him.
Someone asked, what was your Taft pun?
Oh, my Taft pun. From fore to aft. Apparently Alice Roosevelt could do a really devastating impression of Mrs. Taft, where she would like stick her chin out, and they hated each other because everyone thought Alice was cooler than Mrs. Taft was.
Ellen Kirshner writes that her son grew up watching South Park, and that definitely affected his sense of humor.
I have a soft spot for South Park because I think it's funny, like growing up in sort of the like Bush era humor, where it's just like the funniest possible joke is also like the most outrageous possible joke. And I feel like these days that's not always, people are like, no, there are other ways of making jokes. And like, as a Robert Benchley stan, to use a modern term, I'm very excited that we're sort of moving in a direction. Like sometimes you can just like have a funny sentence, or like P.G. Wodehouse. Like if you just have the right analogy, that can power your motor for days. Just like a funny simile. Just like things don't have to be like as shocking as possible to be funny. They can also just be like beautifully constructed, or like Key and Peele, I think, did some of the best like sort of satire where the joke is that you're fully inhabiting a format. So it's like, this is going to be like a perfect note for note parody of like a horror movie. And which is why like he was able to just go and make a great horror movie, because like if you really pay attention to form, you can do this like great parody. So I feel like attentiveness is really in these days. And before it was just like, what's the biggest, most outrageous thing that could possibly happen? But it was also like, I do still rewatch a lot of it with like affection. So I think it's hard to be like, that formative thing was like, it's interesting watching them continuing to do it now, because there's so many different jokes being made. And I think they certainly made a bunch of jokes that have not held up. And sometimes it's just like you're living in your own tunnel of experience. But they were formative for me as well.
Someone asked what you think of Sarah Cooper.
Oh, she's very funny. I'm really excited to see her show, because it's like all the stuff that wasn't Trump material. Because I'm just so excited for people like her who have like clearly like been perfecting their comedy chops for years and are now like ready to go do jokes that are not just about this one thing, where it's this guy who does the same thing every day, like, and it's kind of outrageous, but it's sort of repetitive. And there was a review of her like special that was just like, get excited, because this is all the stuff that she couldn't do because she was too busy having to pour her creativity into this man. So I'm really stoked on it.
Do you regret not going to Oxford? Because there in London, you would have acquired a British sense of humor.
Oh man, and I would put "use" in all my words, and I would say "can do" instead of "can." I assume I'd probably be insufferable, I think. Well, no, I hope I wouldn't be, but I do appreciate British humor. And although, yeah, like, I mean, Wodehouse specifically, and others as well. But I like American humor. We've got some of the greats. So it's as good as any humor in the world.
Alexandra, how long is your writing day or working day?
Well,
is there a beginning? Is there an end? Or is it?
Well, so my editor has a good work-life balance, and so he's off at 5. So if I don't get it in by 5, it's not going in. So that's a powerful incentive. And if I want to have like a good editing process that isn't him saying, it's 4:45 and you just got this to me, do you expect me to look at it now? Then I need to get it in before that. So it's mostly a race to get something in around like 2-ish, so we can have like a good solid editing time, which means that I'll wake up, I'll absorb as much news as I can, and if I didn't already have an idea, I'll try to make certain I have one by like 11:30 on the dot, so we can tell people at the meeting what my idea was. And then I just type, and sometimes I get up and have a cracker. It's riveting. It's a riveting day.
Do you get up at 3 a.m. when you have an inspiration and, make notes?
No, I'm more of a night owl. So I'll be sitting there at 3 a.m. having an inspiration, and then I'll conk out. And I do a lot of writing on my phone, which is bad because it's like, here's the most distracting possible place full of all the things that aren't anything to do with what you should be working on. And you're going to work there. That's where you're choosing to work. Is like going to like a club or like a big mall full of excitement and just like trying to have a concentrated time. But I do have like a big file of ideas. And then I sometimes will start writing these because it does conduce to brevity. Writing with your thumbs is very conducive to a shorter sentence and I like a good short sentence rather than the sentence that inevitably comes out when I'm at the keyboard, which tends to be somewhat longer and less to the point.
Are you assuming that people are reading your column on their phones?
These days, I think like 60% of everything you do online is on your phones. And so I'm assuming it's around that. But if there's a good picture, I hope they will read it on their computer. But yeah, I don't do anything with the formatting that would necessitate having the screen be a screen. She said coherently.
Someone asks, do you hang out with cartoonists?
I think cartoonists are the coolest.
Do you do stand-up still?
I haven't in a while. I've done humorous readings. I'll get up on stage periodically, but not like stand-up per se. That's an honorable life, but I prefer like the thing that I like most about what I get to do now is that I get to do something new every day. And the amount of time you have to work on your material when you're a stand-up, I just feel like having to say the same jokes enough times to perfect them I prefer the discipline of having to generate new ones to the discipline of having to really just nail all those pauses and balances. I don't have the patience for it, I think.
Someone is asking about something you said that sounded like Me Miranda.
Oh, Memorandum. Yeah, it's just a website where you can see trending news stories.
Terry Ann Thompson has found a slogan for you. Make America funny again.
Hey!
You can put that under your name with each column.
Oh yeah, no, democracy dies in darkness, but also in decreasing fonts. I want to have like 6 slogans, all getting smaller and smaller, like an eye test. Democracy does die in darkness.
And in humorlessness.
If you can't laugh, that's tough. No, but I do think having a sense of humor, it doesn't mean that you aren't taking things seriously. It's not like Oscar Wilde said, a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. I think you do know the value of things and you want to be able to continue to wring joy from your existence, even when things look bleak. That's why I think, reportedly, I've never heard them, like doctors or such cut-ups, apparently. They're constantly like, because you have to keep joking in order to stay human in certain environments. And I feel like certainly the last year, but all time, people joke to stay human.
We appreciate your extremely positive attitude, and we'll keep reading you, and we'll keep laughing, and hopefully, so will the rest of the world. We appreciate your coming on and talking to us.
Oh, I appreciate your having me. This is fun. I like seeing everyone's books. Lamps.
Well, the rest of them do have the power broker behind them.
Yes. No, well, my next book is a bunch of American history humor. So I need to get the power broker out and delve into it.
Oh, really? Oh, tell us. You're working on a book?
I am. It's I think the title is still TBD, but it's sort of like a fake documentary history of the United States where you just a bunch of found documents that you think would probably have existed based on things that happened. And it's been fun. I always wind up stuck on Cotton Mather every time I tried this idea, but there's going to be a lot of Cotton Mather content. So gird your loins.
When will that come out? Or is it the beginning or the? It's
sort of the middle. I've written enough of it to feel like I can talk about it safely. Because, sometimes when you have like an idea initially, you're like, I can't mention this to anyone or it'll vanish. But I've got about, I think, slightly over a third of it done now. So whenever I finish it, probably a year after that.
When did you do your Awkward Silence book?
2015. And I have a new book out right now that's a compilation of columns basically from the past 4 years. So, which is called Nothing is Wrong and Here's Why. So if anyone wants a beautiful edition of that with Saturn devouring his children on the cover, it is out now.
Nothing is wrong and here's why. It sounds like something Trump would say. Okay. We'll all look for that. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you all for coming today. I think it was a great program. And see you next month.